So Steve, you are the godfather of the lean startup cult, or I guess I should say
that means I'm old.
Well, you're the Joseph Smith then of the lean startup cult.
That means I'm dead.
So, but what's cool about this phenomenon, which I've observed and now I'm somewhat living, there's the valley is filled with the kind of white noise of the cliches of the lean startup world, the MVP and the pivots and all this stuff. But, and this is where it turns into a compliment, but if you're not doing lean startup methodology, if you're not following the stuff that you have been talking about for 10 years, right now, if you're not doing that, the assumption is you're doing something wrong, that you're ignorant, that you're making mistakes. And that is fascinating to me, that it has become relatively quickly a code by which if you are not living that by those precepts, you are doing it wrong. Is that your impression as well?
I just find it funny. It turns out that we were doing lots of stuff for 30 or 40 years in Silicon Valley, and companies were going public and making money, et cetera. But just some backstory, and I'm not sure I ever told this story, is I retired after 8 startups and 4 IPOs, but really I learned the most from two craters so deep they left their own iridium layer. And I decided when I retired I wanted to watch my kids grow up, because I had watched a bunch of entrepreneurs I had thought were wonderful at work, but actually had feet of clay at home, and their kids grew up and didn't know who they were. And just as an aside for any of you who have families, there's a blog post I wrote called Epitaph for an Entrepreneur, of how to balance what you do in work, but also what you do with the rest of your life. And so I was writing my memoirs, which I thought the world really needed. And I had a flash of insight at the time. It was actually due to a book I had read, which was there was a sociologist in the mid-1950s who wrote a book called Hero with a Thousand Faces. Anybody ever read Joseph Campbell at all? It used to be, required college reading. And Campbell had this interesting notion that said, look, every myth about heroes in any culture, whether it was Greek or Roman or Chinese or Norse myths or from the Bible, all had a common theme. And the theme went with the hero was called, and he turned down the calling, and then something tragic happened, and then he went on the quest, got some companions with him, went through physical or spiritual trials, and then a death and rebirth, and then some insight. And that's not only the story of the Bible and Moses, but it's the story of Luke Skywalker, because George Lucas stole it from Joseph Campbell. For those who know the screenwriting history. Why I'm telling you this long, shaggy dog story is here I was as an entrepreneur who did 8 startups and by then was sitting on public boards, advising others. And at that time, at the turn of the 21st century, every entrepreneur believed their journey was a singular one. That is, what I'm doing, no one else could have anything in common. It was all about me. And my journey is, there's no pattern here. It was just about my technology and my customers and my market. And the hair started standing up on the back of my neck when I realized the stories I was writing about what I had done and others had done actually had a repeatable pattern identical to Joseph Campbell and the hero's journey. And the repeatable pattern was startups aren't smaller versions of large companies. That we were making a mistake of trying to follow all the rules of big companies, that we needed our own rules, and we could probably tease out what that pattern is for early stage entrepreneurs. And that pattern became the lean startup.
Right.
And I didn't answer your question because I forgot what it was.
No, that was good. That was good. You just proved the high priest point. Okay, so the precepts of this are well known, and I don't want to make this kind of remedial lean startup stuff, because I want to get to the nitty-gritty of applying it to health. But when we think about the things that you have explained to people, and once they resonate in your head, they seem self-obvious. But those are the best ideas are always self-obvious.
I describe the process as no math involved, which is why I could handle it. Right.
So these things like customer development and measurement and feedback, and this idea about growth. I mean, startups are all about growth, and I know we have some disagreements with Paul Graham, or you have some disagreements with Paul Graham on that score. But a lot of these things, a lot of these core principles, a lot of them are complicated when you start bringing them to healthcare. And things like customer development, well, that's easy to do when you're creating a kind of consumer web play, say a video game or something. you know who the customer is. But when you come to healthcare, and you're talking about a tool for patients, but the payers are, but they have to get it through the hospitals or the clinic or its employee wellness program. And you're going through this tangled maze of customers or potential customers. How do you just get started on that?
It's a great question, because take even med devices, there are actually 5 or 6 different customer segments. You need a roadmap. And so for me, the sum of the lean startup, and by the way, I wrote an article that was the cover of this May's Harvard Business Review, which describes it like to your mother. If you want to get a copy of it, it's free on my website, steveblank.com. Just click on the HBR article. But basically, it says, look, we need, as entrepreneurs, different tools than the ones we built in the last 100 years in business school. Well, we built, any MBAs in the room? You could admit it. Come on. All right. What you did is went to a great school which taught you wonderful skills for a job you're not in. All right? All right? No, seriously. If you think about what the title of MBA is, it's Master of Business Administration. You learn skills that were developed over the last 100 years on how to administer and execute an existing corporation. What we never even had was a language to understand that early stage ventures are very different, and here's how they're different. Existing companies execute known business models, which is a fancy word for saying you know who your customers are, and you probably know your channel and pricing and competitors, et cetera. But startups, all of you, you're searching for a business model. And those same tools that work for execution are typically not just useless, but are typically destructive when doing search. Therefore, the lean startup is a set of tools, and the stack is right now pretty simple. 3 tools. One is the business model canvas. That's Alexander Osterwalder's work. Anybody ever read Business Model Generation? You should all have it on your desk. He basically says, look, we could describe all the stuff that's important for you to know on day one in one slide. 9 boxes. What are you building? He calls it value proposition. Who are you building it for? Customer segments. What's the channel? How are you getting and keeping customers, customer relationships? How are you making money? Do you need partners, resources, activities, and costs? And instead of thinking about sales, marketing, biz dev, and functional organization, we're going to think about the business model first. And when we use it in context of the lean startup, we use it as a scorecard first to set up our initial hypotheses. Big idea, and I'll get back to that word. The second thing about the lean startup is we set up a process to test those hypotheses with some rigor. And that activity is called customer development. The third piece is, unlike what we used to do in the old days of simply spec and build the product, we're going to build our product iteratively and incrementally using something called agile engineering. So these 3 components, business model design, customer development, and agile engineering, are the fancy things that make up the lean startup. So it took 3 minutes to get us to the place you didn't want me to describe, but now I'll take it for healthcare. By the way, business model canvas, I use the word hypotheses. And by the way, I use the word hypotheses to point out to my students at Stanford is that we're allowed to use that word in classroom because their parents are paying $50,000 a year. But outside of Stanford, the word hypotheses really mean effing guesses. And on day one, with all due respect to those of you who are domain experts, you're still guessing about some or all of your business model. You really are. So on day one, you really ought to think that a startup is nothing more than a faith-based enterprise. Right? It's a religious activity. Right? You have to believe. Right? Think about it. As a founder, if you guys are founders, you have to believe. You have to believe because you need to convince yourself, you need to convince investors, you need to recruit employees, you need to, but in the back of your head, I now want to insert 10 neurons that says, what if you're wrong? 2 is the customer development process simply says 2 things. One is there are no facts inside your building, so get the hell out. We spend an enormous amount of time arguing with each other about features or customers or pricing. You know what? None of you have any facts. And if you do, great, then we can have an honest discussion. In my classes, and when we teach this for the National Science Foundation, in 10 weeks, we have eyeballed, not just surveyed, but eyeballed 100 customers face-to-face. Now we have a conversation we can have. And the implicit part of this is you might be the smartest people in your building, but you're not smarter than the collective intelligence of your potential customers. So why don't we figure out what that is now? And then the third piece for agile engineering is we used to build the entire product on the premise that, well, implicitly I understand the customer problem, so why don't I just start coding or building hardware or doing something? When in fact the reality is that somewhere between 80 and 90% of most product features are unneeded or unwanted by the time we ship. Now let me answer your question.
Turns out, you still remember it?
Yeah, I still do on this one. Turns out the game I love to play for some of my students who are doing devices is somebody making a new version of artificial hip. And again, smart engineers, but who's the customer? Oh, my grandmother. Great. Is your grandmother putting the hip in herself? Well, no, Steve. Obviously, there's a doctor involved. Great. Doctor board certified? Well, I guess. Yeah, great. Is the doctor putting in the hip in his office? Professor Blank, they're using a hospital. Okay, well, will the hospital let any hip in any doctor? Oh, I don't know. And by the way, who's paying for the hip? It goes on our Visa or MasterCard? Oh, no, there's insurance. Well, did you ever hear of a CPT code? No, what's that? Oh, well, really? Oh, that's kind of going to be interesting. So who do you think will give you that code? Oh, I guess an insurance company. Well, aren't they a partner? Well, they might be someday, but on day one they're a customer because unless you talk to them, they don't get to be a partner. Great. Do we have all the pieces? Well, can I just make up a hip in my garage and kind of implant it? Oh, there might be some regulations. Yeah, you guys know what a 510K or a PMA is? No, what's that? Oh, congratulations. So now if we start thinking about all and by the way, where are you going to trial this stuff? Oh, I guess I'll run trials in the U.S. Oh, why are you laughing? You know what? That's for me to know and for you to find out. And literally, in the span of a 5-minute conversation, their head is spinning around. But now we could use the business model canvas. Think about it. Patient. Okay. The patient, that's a customer segment, but for everything you put on that canvas in a customer segment, I need a value proposition. Why is the patient using that device? Oh, because her hip just failed. Great. How much is she paying? Well, maybe a $100 deductible. Well, who else is paying? Oh, there's an insurance company. That's another in the beginning, customer segment. Well, what's the value proposition for them? Oh, it's more effective than great, doctor, value proposition, revenue model, etc. So you now need to march through the canvas, and on day one, I will make you, and I make my students, write them all down. Go ahead, put them all up on the wall. Great hypotheses. And most students come in, because they're incredibly smart, saying, okay, I'm done with the class. What else are we going to do? And I start laughing. Now you're going to get the hell out of the building and test every one of those hypotheses. That's it. You're going to teach yourself what the facts are. Does that make sense? And for med devices, it's actually a lot of fun because unlike life sciences or digital health, where there are actually a lot more variables, med devices are probably the easiest part in life sciences to kind of go test because there are fixed players with known ways they play the game. A lot more variables in other places.
So when you were starting to think about digital health or life sciences, you thought that the lean startup stuff didn't apply at all, though, right?
I put it in writing in my book. I said, life sciences is the only space where you really don't need to do this. It's all about the technology, and come see me when you've gotten your phase 2 trials or PMA or 510K, and it has nothing to do with the lean startup.
But then tell the NSF the new data that you have.
So there are two things that happened that made me kind of eat my words on this one. One is the National Science Foundation adopted this, not the NIH yet, but the NSF, adopted this process, and in particular adopted my class as the standard for commercializing science funded by the NSF in the United States. And what that meant was I rewrote my class for them so it could be taught a couple days at a university and then remotely, and then a day back, then 2 days back in a university. We built a prototype class, very quickly scaled it so it was taught by 11 other universities. We're teaching 300 to 400 teams a year over the last couple of years this process. And I think the thing you're referring to is the NSF just found something out which they didn't bother to tell anybody, classic NSF, which is they've been running a control and an experiment. They've been running teams through this process called the Innovation Core, and they've been running teams through the standard SBIR, STTR program. And the teams through the standard 30-year-old SBIR, STTR program, they said, well, how successful were those teams getting funded by both NSF and commercial venture? And the answer was, oh, no different than the last 10 or so years, about 18%. Great. Well, how successful were the teams who went through the Innovation Corps? 60%. 300% greater. Except they forgot to tell anybody. I said, did you tell anybody? Oh, we told Congress. What else did you guys do? Well, we thought it was unethical to continue the experiment, so now we require for even people just showing up at the SBIR conference, you have to watch the lectures online and talk to 20 customers to even show up at the conference. And so they're going to make this an integral part of the NSF process. Because if you're really, anybody get or are familiar with SBIR and STTR program, right? It's government funding, basically. Government through all research organizations, whether it's NIH or NSF or DARPA, has to give up about 3% of their budget for commercialization. And it turns out we've been doing this for 30 years, giving $500,000 and then $1 million grants depending on the phase. We've essentially been giving away cars without driver's ed. And we've been kind of surprised that they kept crashing. And so the class I teach, this whole process is nothing more than driver's ed for commercialization. And what we're going to do, can I mention what we're doing this fall? And I think, is Abbas here? There he is. It's one of our instructors. We're going to be teaching this class for therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and digital health at UCSF starting October 1st. It's open to anybody. You have to apply as a team. You get interviewed as a team. We turn a lot of people down. But if you're serious about building a startup and want to go through this process, I think UCSF charges an enormously expensive fee of like $100. And so it's me and a bunch of venture capitalists. And what cohort are you going to be teaching? Digital health. So this is our digital health instructor. We're breaking the class into 4: therapeutics, diagnostics, devices, and digital health.
So I want to ask about so the customer kind of customer deployment or customer
discovery
evaluation
process.
Stuff.
Yep.
That we've tackled. But then you have the question about the MVP,
Yes.
right? Which is difficult in healthcare because you want to create a kind of lean, quick, fast and dirty. I mean, it's not so simple, but you want to create something that you can start testing propositions on.
Right.
But when you're talking about a highly regulated environment, there are all sorts of barriers to entry to just putting something in front of people, just trying to test it in a very simple, fast, quick way, let alone trying to convince a hospital or an insurer to even bother talking to you because you're just a pesky startup.
Right. So and for everybody, MVP is minimum viable product, and it's part of the idea that says instead of going through the traditional alpha test, beta test, first customer ship, we're actually going to figure out how to use pieces of the product to test our hypotheses. That is, we're not testing the engineering part, that's the bits. We'll help engineering do that separately. But what we're really trying to test is our assumptions about what features customers care about.
Those effing guesses.
Right, those effing guesses. In fact, the two most important things in that business model canvas is what features are you building and for who? And those two things, those first two boxes in that business model canvas, we have a special word for it called product market fit. Some of you might have heard that phrase. Product market fit just says, listen, to be arguing about pricing or channel or marketing before we even figure out that someone cares and wants about that stuff is kind of silly. So let's make sure we test this. And this is back to your question about, so how do we test whether people want what we're building without violating ethics or whatever? And the answer is, I'm going to give you the only time I use this business school phrase, which is, it depends. And it depends on where are you in the beginning of in the process. Are you in the beginning? Are you further on, et cetera? And by the way, what are we trying to test? Are we trying to test, the insurance company's willingness to pay? Are we trying to test whether consumers will use it? Or are we trying to test whether doctors will refer it? That is, we could break down the MVP problem into something different than show me a smaller version of the product. That is, the test could be nothing to do with the product. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And the other thing is that people tend to confuse MVPs with, oh, did I get an order? Right? Gee, I'm selling. And the mistake is, no, you're not selling. In fact, to think about that test as anything of I got revenue and users, at least early on, is a mistake. What I'm trying to get is insight from those tests. And by the way, early on, 90% of people will throw you out. What you're looking for are early evangelists, which are essentially crazy people like you. And the test is, if you can't find any crazy people like you, it doesn't get better over time. No, seriously, right? If there aren't anybody else who shares your passion and vision, assume you're going to get no's from, my heuristic is 19 out of 20 people don't get what you're doing. But if the answer is 0 out of 20 and 0 out of 40, no, seriously, which is why we talk to 100 people in a quarter or a semester. Now all of a sudden you're getting some also useful data that it doesn't get better over time, that perhaps we don't have product market fit, or perhaps we're not showing the product or the MVP is insufficient in detail to garner an adequate response.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. But I'm wondering, is it your perception, or would you agree that the feedback cycles are slower in a healthcare environment, that it's just more difficult to kind of get the ping and the response that you're trying to test?
I don't necessarily believe that unless you're doing hardware. I remind my students, which one of them almost every quarter now, there's a team that proves me right, that unless you're getting escorted out of a hospital, you're not doing it hard enough. And I have photos of teams at Berkeley being escorted out of UCSF and escorted out of about 4 or 5 major hospitals around the Bay Area. You know, trying to go to talk to diabetes patients directly and trying to talk to X or Y, and now some of the security people go, let me guess, Professor Blank's class. I think I'm making up a hall pass. But the answer is, what you need to be figuring out is how to do cheap hacks. This is not how to meet the NIH, standards for X or Y, and there's a very fine line on that. Obviously, I'm not asking for experimentation on live patients you Shanghai, at the bar, though that's a thought I've never had, actually. I'm asking for rapid, how do we get some data that tells us whether we're even on the right path? And if you're in the software business, you should be able to do that, maybe not as rapidly as your counterparts building, iOS mobile apps, but pretty fast. And I've seen that happen.
Well, so what about...
And let me give you another example. In fact, let me give you a counter example. I had a team building the canonical. I always have one every quarter who's doing devices. Let's build a diabetes test kit that plugs into a mobile device. Anybody doing that in the room? Don't raise your hand. All right. But like I said to these guys, well, any of you have diabetes? No. Well, why are you doing this? Well, my brother does. Oh, well, that's pretty, okay, so now we're once removed. Well, why do you do, well, I watch him stick his fingers, a couple times a day. I said, well, what do you know what it feels like? Well, I watch him. I said, what do you know what it feels like? His entire team pricked their fingers for the entire 10 weeks. And when they talked to patients, they were now be able to show their calluses on their fingers. And all of a sudden, they had a much different interaction than a bunch of, smart techies who thought they had a solution to a problem. They were now, and I'm not suggesting you come down with a major disease to do this, but they were definitely getting close to the customer in a way that I thought was pretty unusual.
So can you tell us what happened with that idea, that product?
They actually started a software company. But actually, the software company they built is actually something called the Launchpad Central, which we use to manage all our teams. So they fell in love with the process so much that they actually built the software to manage it.
So okay, are you saying that healthcare is not a different animal, or that it's simply...
Healthcare is tractable, I guess the way I would. Healthcare requires more creativity. It certainly requires a deep understanding of some of the rules about ethics and patient responsibility. And I don't mean to be glib. There certainly is a ton more stuff I worry about and my teams worry about. But to get into the mindset that you can't do this, that this is the software guys do this, you're just putting yourself in a very expensive place that you're going to burn a lot more cash than necessary.
Right, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is the scale of the problems in healthcare it's okay. Let me be cynical. It's one thing to do a lean startup and create a nifty parking app, right, or a restaurant review app or something. It's another thing to try to change the way Medicare spending is being conducted, and to create a product that eliminates fraud in insurance or something like that. Some big part of a very big problem. And do the lean startup ideas, do they? I think you've made a good case that they transfer, but does the scale of time shift so that you have to kind of recalibrate expectations?
Right. So some of the problems are so big that you're talking about not technology, that the reality is they're political problems. So I'll give you the equivalent is, changing healthcare, right? We just spent 50 years trying to do that, and we're still, what are we on, vote 39 to, repeal, vote 40, and, so those are, it's like reforming education, right? Anybody familiar with charter schools? I mean, it's not a technology problem, it's a political problem, right? So lean startup is only a small piece of this, but so that's a different characteristic of the...
So you're not saying that you're promising a key to cure all the world's ills?
Well, so for example, if you told me, I'll give you an example in this room. When I mentioned the National Science Foundation program, the NSF was so excited, they said, Steve, we're going to scale the program. Great, you guys got a $7 billion budget. Let's do some math. It'll cost you about $20 million to run it full scale. Great. And this was the program manager for SBIR, and then he calls me back next week and said, we got a $7 billion budget, but we're not allowed to move $20 million around. It'll go into next year's budget. I went, next year's budget? That's another year. I mean, an entrepreneur, that's like a lifetime. That's 4 startups. And he said, Steve, we got people working it on Washington. I said, well, what do you work? Well, Steve, it's Congress, the House Appropriations Committee. I said, thanks. He said, what do you mean? I said, don't worry about it. So I looked up who the head of the House Appropriations Committee was and flew to Washington and made believe I was calling an enterprise sales process and found a Congressman Lipinski, who was a Democrat from Illinois, who this was a hot item for him. And Congressman Lipinski said, what the hell are we waiting for next year? Let's do a special line item for this. But he said, before I come in front of Congress and put my rear end on the line, is this class any good? I said, well, I'm teaching it at Stanford. He said, well, that's funny. I got my master's from Stanford. So my class started 2 years ago in September, and first day of class is, hi, I'm Sally, mechanical engineering. Hi, I'm Dave, computer science. Hi, I'm Congressman Lipinski from Illinois. Now, only in Stanford, no one would blink. And really, no one said a word. Sat through the class. We had pizza. He said, okay, you're going to get $20 million. Next week, I get a call from the NSF, said, you wouldn't believe what happened. I said, yeah, what a surprise. They had no idea. They still don't. You're the first people to ever hear this in public. So the answer is, some of these problems, when they're tractable, if you are an entrepreneur, everything's just an obstacle to be removed, right? And this was for the good of the country. We weren't screwing anybody. It wasn't really, even the Republicans loved it. I mean, it was a bipartisan thing because we were actually... No, if you think about it, we're actually getting better use of taxpayer funds. We're still spending, billions of dollars on the SBIR program. We now figured out how to make it, we believed, and now we could prove, more efficient. My point to answer your question is, sometimes these problems are truly intractable. You need to talk to 435 congressmen, kind of hard. But if you could figure out how to make something happen, then that's just one more thing in your path of, okay, I got to get Congress to vote a line item budget. How do you do that? I don't know, but I'll figure it out. That's what I used to do as an entrepreneur. Does that?
Yeah, I have nothing to say.
And by the way, he's going to be out here. Congressman Lipinski is going to come out to Stanford and UCSF to sit through the UCSF life science version because he's now calling up the NIH going, so how come you guys aren't doing this? And we'll see what will happen next year.
All right. Thank you very much for joining us. And before you applaud vigorously, his first book, or not the first book, but the 4 Steps to Epiphany, is just out in second edition a couple weeks ago. So it's worth picking up.
We inserted 3,000 commas and actually finished a lot of the sentences.
Well done. Thank you very much.